Hi, a film that I was finally delighted to be able to see last week was Wes Anderson's new film, The French Dispatch, an anthology story about a newspaper operating in a small French city. The film had originally been scheduled for release in the summer of last year, having been set to premiere at the Cannes Film Festival, but obviously the pandemic got in the way. It was pushed back and pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, and eventually was released in October of this year. It's an anthology story, which is something of a departure for Anderson, and based around the idea of a newspaper set up for American readers, but in a French city, so it carries long form articles on a variety of subjects. The inspiration, obviously, being the New Yorker. The framing device is that this is a screen version of articles from the final issue of the magazine. We begin with an obituary for its editor, who has died and demanded as part of his will that the magazine immediately cease publication and that the printing presses be melted down. We follow with a travelogue bringing us around the town of Ennui-sur-Blasey, which in French literally means boredom on top of boredom, the beautiful archetypal mid-century French town. We then have three stories. The first is the story of a painter creating extraordinary modern art while serving 2 life sentences for murder. The second is about a journalist who becomes involved in a student revolution, trying to maintain her distance but getting too involved with those participating and leading it. The final story, and it will come to what was the final story? It'll come to me. I remember now. There's a lot to talk about with this film. Is ostensibly supposed to be a food criticism piece about police cuisine, that which can be eaten with one hand while writing reports with the other, and winds up turning into a crime story about the abduction of the chief of police's son and turning into an action scene towards the end. Even by Wes Anderson standards, this is a colossal production. It has a gigantic cast, led by Bill Murray as the editor of the magazine, even though he only appears briefly in the framing sequences. The travel writer is played by Owen Wilson. The three journalists for the three sectors are Tilda Swinton, Frances McDormand, and Jeffrey Wright. And we also have Benicio del Toro, Léa Seydoux, Timothée Chalamet, Mathieu Amalric, even the likes of Christoph Waltz appears in 2 scenes and has, I think, 3 lines of dialogue and a terrible wig. So it's it's an extraordinary production to have an absolutely packed cast telling these various stories. It's it's a hugely engaging film. It seems to me to be largely about the idea of storytelling, of passing on these extraordinary stories. That the French Dispatch itself was originally founded simply as a way of telling stories that the editor found interesting to those back home in Liberty, Kansas, his hometown, and the official US home of the magazine. And with the stories being told in retrospect, in many cases, particularly the first and last stories, the prison story and the food critic story, are being narrated years later by their writers as part of a televised lecture and a TV interview, respectively. The idea of journalism moving on, but still being highly respected. And the characters are fascinating and wonderful. A story about art in prison becomes this fascinating portrait of the extraordinary people who are involved in it. The journalist telling the story of the chessboard revolution in Blasé gets so engaged in the cause, even though the specifics of the cause are never really outlined, that she winds up taking the leader's virginity and winds up acting as matchmaker between him and the girl who loves him. And the final story is really a melancholy recounting of the journalist's past life, how he has memories of being in prison, having been arrested for the crime of being gay, and having some sympathy towards others in similar situation, as well as getting involved in this breakneck chase across town. The film uses a wide palette of storytelling styles. We have conventional flashback, it's called in color and black and white, different settings. We have TV interviews, lectures, dramatic recreations, photographs, tableau, and even towards the end of the movie, we lapse into, for an action scene, full hand-drawn animation with the action suddenly turning into a Tintin cartoon as redrawn by Daniel Close. It's a very rich, very engaging film. It's filled with stories. It's filled with people. It's filled with learning about people whose lives are totally different from your own. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be a female prison warder in a male prison? This is a film that tells you what that might be like. Or being gay in mid-century France, or being the son of a chief of police and how that might influence your childhood. All these incredibly rich pencil sketches of characters filled out in this film. I found it intensely enjoyable. One of my favourite Anderson films. I still think that The Grand Budapest Hotel is the pinnacle of his work, but this ranks on just one rung below that. Um, Hugely entertaining, very funny, but tremendously humane. That's Anderson's great gift, is that regardless of who the person is, be they a hotel concierge, a journalist, a convicted criminal, any kind of person, he finds them all incredibly fascinating and is incredibly interested in them and their lives and their inner life. He's one of the most humane and human directors working today, and I've always enjoyed his work as a result. Even the films that I haven't really cared for, you still see that spark of that love of people and that interest in people's lives, even in the absurd, over stylized world of Anderson films. So I loved it a great deal. It's one of my favourite films so far this year, and I'd recommend it very highly.